Welcome back. I've been on a bit of a quest recently to find out who I believe to be the best 15 running backs in recent history. There's been so many productive running backs, and we know by now that you don't have to be an elite running back to be a very productive one. It can sometimes be more to do with system and the offensive line than the actual quality of running back performance. So here's how we're going to try and work this out. We are looking purely at the player's performance across their career, meaning of course we delve into statistics, but it's important to remember that these are only a baseline to try and work out how good each running back was. In terms of trying to figure out the value of longevity versus the value of a running back's peak performance, the way I've tried to look at it is if you were to have this player on your team for the entirety of their career, how valuable would that make them? And the final thing to clarify is that if a player has a career that spans between the 90s and the 2000s, we take their performance starting from the year 2000 and anything they did in the 90s is forgotten for the purpose of this video, as we are trying to figure out the greatest running backs of this century. We will get some notable absences at the end of the video, so if you feel like someone is missing from the list, I'm likely to give my reasoning in that section of the video. We've got a controversial one to start because I've got Le'Veon Bell at number 15. For those who don't remember, Bell had these contract issues with the Steelers, so he didn't play in 2018 and it was never the same. So really you have these 5 seasons between 2013 and 2017, but you can actually remove a couple of these in terms of fully healthy seasons. So we're talking in reality about 3 great seasons. So how does this guy still make the list? First of all, one thing I was reminded of whilst making this list was that even as we speak about the greatest running backs of this generation, most of these guys have around 5 seasons to their name of fully healthy seasons in their prime. So I couldn't have him higher than this because it was just the 3 seasons. However, there has never been another Le'Veon Bell. He was incredibly patient. He would just sort of sit and wait behind the offensive line and simply allow things to open up for him. But then what was amazing is you could never get a hand on him. He would just effortlessly elude defenders without running them over or being at top speed. It wasn't about that. It was kind of bizarre at times where defenders would miss tackles and you almost can't work out why, but that was just the magic of Le'Veon Bell. On top of this, the guy could have been a slot receiver if he wasn't a running back. Very dynamic route runner, and he was genuinely an important part of the passing game. So with Bell, I had the dilemma of working out which one gives you more chance of winning a Super Bowl, a true borderline unstoppable playmaker like Bell, or a guy who maybe gave a couple of extra seasons and was great, but he's not quite going to give you the edge the way a guy like Bell does. I came to the conclusion that it was Le'Veon Bell at number 15. Number 14 is Christian McCaffrey. I really struggled to separate Bell and McCaffrey, but we got a bit more in the way of output from McCaffrey in his career so far. His 2020 and 2021 seasons were ruined by injuries, and this season he's been hurt for the majority. So that leaves us with 5 healthy seasons. You may have noticed that I've left his rookie season in this discussion, despite the fact he didn't have any real production in the way of rushing. He was actually the secondary back in 2017 to Jonathan Stewart. He did, however, prove his value in his rookie season, providing 752 yards and 6 touchdowns in the passing game. I actually think Christian McCaffrey has a lot of similarities to Bell as a player. McCaffrey isn't the biggest or the fastest. In fact, when I watch McCaffrey after having watched all of these great running backs, especially from the 2000s, McCaffrey actually is a bit lightweight in comparison, but he has incredible core strength, incredible strength in his legs, to where he just never seems to go down when he's supposed to. So this is why he's always been efficient, even behind an offensive line in Carolina, which wasn't always giving him much to work with. Then he goes to the 49ers, and I don't think anyone was questioning whether he would be effective in that run game, at least when healthy. But very similar to Bell, if he's not a running back, he'd be a serious slot receiver. One of his biggest achievements was being the 3rd player ever to have 1,000 yards rushing and receiving in the same season. He was the heart and soul of a bad Carolina team, and then last season with the 49ers, he was 3rd in MVP voting, which for a running back in today's day and age is about as good as you're going to get. He's earned his spot at number 14. Brian Westbrook comes in at number 13 on this list, and what makes Brian Westbrook unique is that he is the only running back on this list who never had even a single fully healthy season. The only running back on this list who has less carries to his name in his career so far is Christian McCaffrey. Westbrook was missing games every year, and by the time he was 30, he had been ruined by these injuries. However, this is where we need to make sure that context is involved as we look back and poke around in history. In these 6 seasons, he may have missed a few games a year, but he didn't have one season where he hardly touched the field for the year. He was a vital part of a successful Eagles offense for 6 years. He was there the majority of every season and only had one season where he missed the playoffs due to injury. He was 5'8" and ran a 4.57 40-yard dash, making him the prototypical underrated running back. However, there was no stopping him, because he had this special short area agility, incredibly dynamic between the tackles, and he was tough, stocky. It was a real challenge to bring him down if you could get to him. And between his ability to make people miss and the fact that he had really sticky hands, he was a hugely important outlet for Donovan McNabb in the passing game. They never won a Super Bowl, but this was a very successful Eagles team, and Westbrook was integral to this success. He goes in at number 13. At number 12, I've got Jamal Lewis. Jamal Lewis had an excellent rookie season. He then missed the entirety of his sophomore year due to an ACL tear and an MCL sprain, but he returned in 2002 without missing a beat before one of the greatest rushing seasons of all time in 2003. He then had some injuries in 2004 and he started to slow down from that point on. Didn't really provide enough value in his final season to be included here, but we can't ignore these 5 seasons on the latter side of his career where he wasn't so efficient but still a really good running back. With this said, 2000, 2002 and especially 2003 is what lands him on this list. At a reported 245 pounds, he is going to weigh in as the second heaviest on this list, only by a couple of pounds, but he was only 6 foot tall. Very stocky, extremely powerful, and never had any real long speed even in his prime, but it was the way he was able to chop and change direction in between the tackles that made him special. So if you haven't watched this guy before, don't see a big powerful Ravens running back and think of this guy as Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is more about the inevitable danger of an 80-yard run as he wears down the defense and has the speed to break away. This is more about a consistent grinding of the defense where, combining his size and power and short area quickness, you can't stop him picking up these short but efficient runs. Because remember, 4 yards per carry, if achieved consistently, can win you a Super Bowl, as proven by yours truly. Jamal Lewis goes in at number 12. LeSean McCoy comes in at number 11, or Shady McCoy as he became known, who got the nickname Shady from his mother, who said it was because of his mood swings where one second he would be happy and laughing, and the next second he'd be upset and crying. We've covered Brian Westbrook, whose Eagles career ended in 2009, and who was there to pick up from where he left off, the elusive LeSean Shady McCoy himself. McCoy was statistically efficient and productive across the span of his career where his prime lasted longer than a lot of other guys on this list. If we take away his rookie season where he wasn't the primary back, and chip away his final few years where he just wasn't the same anymore, 2012 and 2015 weren't terrible seasons for McCoy, they were just slightly hampered by injury. But even if we're harsh and we take away those years, we're still left with 6 incredibly productive and efficient seasons. Mainly for the Eagles, but he had a great run for the Bills as well. LeSean McCoy was electric. Very different to Jamal Lewis, who we just spoke about. Certainly not the bruiser that Lewis was, but McCoy had this trait that has come up a few times in this video already, and it will come up again. The ability to make defenders miss. This is why he had so many explosive runs across his career, despite actually his long speed not being all that impressive. Something you may be learning about my personal evaluations of running backs is that short area agility is key, and it doesn't always come hand in hand with a straight line speed. If you're wondering why LeSean McCoy isn't higher based on his production, well, he did this behind some incredible run blocking from his offensive lines across his career, which is the part of these running backs' legacy which we are trying to strip away. I felt he slotted in nicely here, just missing out on the top 10 at number 11. This is one that I'm excited to speak about, because there were 2 or 3 players on this list that when I broke it down, I felt higher on them than where I think the general consensus is. I purposely didn't pay too much attention to other rankings when making this list, so I might have a slightly crooked understanding of where everyone else would have these guys. But Fred Taylor feels underappreciated. Just to make this graphic look like something we can digest here, I'm going to show you the seasons that aren't really worth too much discussion separately, because Fred Taylor played 13 seasons. We're not taking any play from the 90s into consideration as explained earlier in the video. He only played a couple of games in 2001 due to a groin injury, and it seems that 2008 is really where it became clear that Taylor's prime was officially behind him. So 7 seasons of seriously productive numbers. The only not so impressive season here is 2005, where he dealt with a knee injury, but the 6 seasons either side of that, the efficiency to go along with the production year after year is what really impresses me from a statistical point of view. In terms of the eye test, Fred Taylor was ahead of his time. He ran a reported 4.29 40-yard dash at his pro day, which is very unlikely to be completely accurate at a pro day, but there's no doubt that he had serious speed to him, especially when you consider the fact that he was around 220 pounds. This guy had everything. He could make defenders bounce off him, he could drive through crowded spaces and stay on his feet, he was shifty, could make defenders miss, and his speed gave the threat of gashing the defense for big gains. I think he goes under the radar nowadays because certainly at this time nobody really cared about the Jaguars. They weren't a successful team, and so unfairly that holds a guy like Taylor back from ever being spoken about enough to where he starts to be included in the conversation about who the best running back in the league is at that time. So then people's dads or older brothers or whoever, they don't rave about this guy to the younger generation, and a guy like Fred Taylor gets forgotten. I don't have a good excuse for why he's not higher on my list, honestly. We're just at that stage of the ranking where every back we speak about is special, and they all feel like they have an argument to be higher. But Fred Taylor, well deserving of the number 10 spot. Edgerrin James comes in at number 9, and I've probably got him a bit lower than the consensus. This is one where removing the 90s feels kind of harsh, but that's the rules. So 1999 was his rookie season, and he was actually 4th in MVP voting. Won Offensive Rookie of the Year, obviously, but it doesn't get taken into consideration here. He had another incredible season in the year 2000 though, before tearing his ACL in 2001 and not being quite the same guy in 2002. Didn't provide much value in his last couple of years, so this is really 8 seasons with some ups and downs due to injury, like all of these guys. Edgerrin James wasn't as explosive as Fred Taylor or LeSean McCoy, who he's ahead of on this list. He made it happen with his balance. It reminds me a little bit of number 15 on this list, Le'Veon Bell. His contact balance was unbelievable. The amount of times I went back and watched this guy and he made defenders look ridiculous. And this is what we spoke about with Bell. It's where he's not even ploughing through the defender and doing it with brute force. Defenders are just dropping off of him like he's got an invisible force field around him. And the other thing with his balance was balance in the sense that he could change direction and turn upfield so smoothly without any wasted steps. And I would compare this element of his game to Alvin Kamara, where he's not going that fast. In fact, it kind of looks like he's not trying, and yet he's running past defenders because all the subtle twists and turns where other guys break their ankles trying to keep up with him, he does it so smoothly and effortlessly. So that's what made Edgerrin James special. In terms of why he's not higher, you see that he had some inefficient years in his career, and I think it could have been a lesser career if he wasn't playing with Peyton Manning at quarterback, because defenses couldn't commit to stopping the run with the threat of Manning dicing them up. So they would sit off a bit, and he doesn't have even close to the explosiveness that these next 3 guys on the list have. and they of course have other great traits as well. But the speed is what separates them from James, because it means the defense can't afford to make a mistake, otherwise it's a touchdown. But still, at his best, James was incredible. Edgerrin James goes in at number 9. In at number 8, I've got Shaun Alexander. Didn't get much opportunity in his rookie season, and I think it's fair to say that 2005 was the last season in his prime due to injuries, so that leaves us with 5 phenomenal seasons. If Edgerrin James was smooth, Shaun Alexander was sharp. He was an explosive runner who, behind an incredible offensive line that allowed him to attack space, felt unstoppable. He was a bit more of an upright runner, a bit more rigid than most of these guys, but still made defenders miss all the time. He had these nifty shakes and flinches he pulled off at full speed that often made the difference between a 10-yard gain and a 50-yard touchdown. His vision was tremendous, he took full advantage of every crack in the defense, and once he was moving, he was gone. As for why he's not higher, I mentioned the incredible offensive line, and to be clear, that's not a reason why he's not higher, it's just an explanation for why his production was quite as ridiculous as it was, in case you're wondering. Like I say, a bit rigid, didn't have the truly elite traits in terms of speed, power and agility compared to the running backs we're speaking about ahead of him. And he also only had the 5 seasons in his prime, which isn't rare on this list, but he's not standing out in terms of longevity. Whether you think it was more to do with the offensive line or the man himself, Shaun Alexander will go down in history as the 2005 MVP winner. Only 2 running backs have won the award since, but we'll get to them. Shaun Alexander lands at number 8. Number 7 is Chris Johnson. This is another guy with 5 seasons in his prime. He had 2 incredible seasons to begin his career, especially 2009, where he had 2,037 rushing yards, which is the 7th most in a season all time and 4th most in this century. He also did this with great efficiency with 5.7 yards per carry. He was still great in the 3 seasons after that, although he wasn't quite the same beast, but his last 2 seasons provided no real value at all, so 8 seasons of at least being a good running back, but really by 2013 his prime was behind him. And so these are the 5 seasons that are going to land him at number 7 on this list. Chris Johnson ran a 4.24 40-yard dash, which is the 4th fastest at the combine all time, and I think it's important to mention as well that he did this in 2008. Nowadays, in the build-up for the draft, the players train for this drill specifically, in a way that they weren't doing back in 2008, which has led to a significant shift in 40-yard dash times getting faster and faster. When Chris Johnson ran this time, nobody was touching him. As we know, speed doesn't make you a good player in the NFL. It can be the thing that takes your skill set from being good to elite, but you must have other great things about you as a player. Chris Johnson is what happens when you combine the freakish straight line speed with vision and poise, as well as having the agility and the balance, which doesn't always come along with the speed. Now, this isn't a guy who I think would be fine without the offensive line. He's obviously not the biggest, and whilst I've spoken positively about his agility and balance, which I think I'm right to in comparison to most players, I don't think he thrives in that area enough when I compare him to the guys he's competing with on this list. So what I'm saying is, if we put all of these guys behind a genuinely bad offensive line, Johnson might be 15th on this list. On the flip side, if we put them all behind a great offensive line, he wouldn't be first on the list, but he might just about scrape the top 5. And I value that more because the plan is always to win a Super Bowl. Nobody is playing for their running back to drag the team from earning the number 1 pick to just missing out on the playoffs. The whole point of having one of these elite players is so that they can be an important piece in a very successful offense. Chris Johnson gives you that Super Bowl upside. The fact the Titans never took advantage of it, that's not something he can control. He goes in at number 7. At number 6, I've got Jamal Charles, famously known as the most efficient running back in history, and you know I love that because I'm all about the efficiency. Didn't really get the opportunities in his rookie seasons, so we'll remove that. tore his ACL in 2011 before returning very strongly in 2012, but he unfortunately tore his ACL again in 2015, and that was his career effectively over. So only the 5 productive seasons, but those 5 seasons were obviously sensational. This is one of those guys I felt higher on, like I spoke about with Fred Taylor. I think he gets held back in this discussion because he's 59th all-time in rushing. You have the likes of Ezekiel Elliott, for example, who had a short prime and hasn't even finished his career yet. He's ahead of Jamal Charles in all-time rushing. But this goes back to a similar conversation we've just had about Chris Johnson, the subtle and almost philosophical differences in value. Charles gave the Chiefs a window to compete for a Super Bowl, with 5 of the best seasons a running back has ever provided. My point being that he's behind the likes of Ezekiel Elliott in rushing because Elliott has provided mediocre play that makes him almost good enough to be the main running back on a team for the last 5 seasons. It's not the type of running back play that should be coming into this conversation, but he's still technically racking the yards up on his all-time production, despite the fact that this is production you can replace. You can't replace the seasons that Charles gave the Chiefs. Jamal Charles ran a 4.38 40-yard dash, which is serious speed, as he also achieved this in 2008, like Chris Johnson, which is real speed, as he also achieved this in 2008, like Chris Johnson, which, as we spoke about, is more impressive before the type of training that goes into that drill nowadays. The reason Charles goes ahead of Johnson is because Charles, although he didn't have quite the ridiculous speed of Johnson, in terms of balance and agility, it's not as much the abrupt shifts and change in direction. It's more to me about the short, sharp movements for a running back that allows them to perfectly weave through a barrage of bodies and truly cut through a defense. That's what Jamal Charles was all about. Charles had a great offensive line for most of his career, but not unfairly so throughout to where his efficiency doesn't mean anything. He was the perfect weapon in a good offense due to his ability to recognize every crack in the defense, and then I would argue that his movement in terms of speed combined with the fluidity and balance was the best of this generation, barring, I would say, 2 players we have to come on this list. The only reason he isn't higher is because he was lighter than the guys ahead of him, and he did only have the 5 elite seasons. Jamal Charles is number 6. The complete opposite side of the spectrum compared to those last few guys is Frank the Tank Gore. Frank Gore spent 10 years with the 49ers before another 6 years with the Colts, Dolphins, Bills and Jets. And what's incredible is he maintained a high standard for pretty much the entirety of the 16 seasons. He had 9 seasons with over 1,000 yards. I know this kind of second career he had in his 30s looks uninspiring due to the lack of efficiency in particular, but these offensive lines weren't helping him out at all. And I went back and watched him with the Jets in his very last season, and he still looked sharp. I'm not saying he would have been tearing the league up with a good offensive line, but he looked like a starting running back still. At 5'9", running a 4.65 40-yard dash, you can understand him not being drafted until the 3rd round. However, Frank Gore was stocky, powerful, and he was explosive. He didn't have the long speed that translates to a 40-yard dash time, and this doesn't always get spoken about in terms of speed, but I think you can put that down to him having shorter legs and obviously having shorter strides. But in short areas, you don't have that same issue. He was incredibly good at sticking his foot in the ground and changing direction. He had remarkable vision and patience, and the ability to stay on his feet through contact was a huge part of what separates him as a talent. The lack of on-paper measurables disguised the fact that he had everything it takes to pick up first downs time and time and time again. I would take prime Chris Johnson or prime Jamal Charles over Frank Gore without hesitation, but Gore was still special enough in his prime for me to side with the longevity argument on this one. Gore is 3rd all-time in career rushing yards and 1st in career rushing yards on this list, and yet he didn't have a single season where he led the league in rushing. I think this perfectly sums up why he is nor lower or higher than number 5 on this list. Derrick Henry comes in at number 4. Henry has a phenomenal resume and he's not done yet, but let's be clear, we are taking his career as it is, we're not trying to predict where he'll be on this list in a few years. Not much workload in his rookie season, but other than that we have 8 seasons with over 900 rushing yards on great efficiency for the most part. I'm sure everyone remembers 2019 and 2020 when, between the stiff arms, the production, and the fact that the Titans were translating this into winning football, Derrick Henry made people fear running backs again, and it looks like this is happening all over again in 2024. For me, Henry has been a tricky evaluation. I watched him on film coming into the year and I couldn't really work him out. In fact, I felt he might be becoming a touch overrated, but going back to an argument I made for a weirdly similar former Titans running back in Chris Johnson, despite the size difference, if all of these backs are behind a bad offensive line, Derrick Henry is right down near the bottom of the list, if not at the bottom with Chris Johnson. Those couple of seconds after Henry gets the ball, he is slow, sluggish, sloppy, whatever you want to call it. But as seen in 2019 and 2020 with Arthur Smith calling plays, and now a dominant Ravens rushing offense, if you set yourself up as a rushing team and you commit to building around Henry, now that makes him borderline unstoppable. Because despite not being so quick in terms of short area agility and balance, once he gets moving, that's 247 pounds, hitting a speed that's going to make you question your life choices as a defender. Especially as we unfortunately have kind of left the era of true hard hitters on defense, the psychos who would actually embrace the challenge of putting their body on the line against Derrick Henry. There's not so many of those big traditional strong safeties prepared for that task anymore. Derrick Henry earned the number 4 spot. Coming in at number 3 is Marshawn Lynch. And this was the guy that I was most excited about on this list because I really do think Lynch gets underappreciated. And don't get me wrong, I know plenty of people give him his flowers, but this is where I think he gets misunderstood by many. I saw someone speaking about how he had the up and down Buffalo career before he went to the Seahawks, and then beast mode became a thing. He won a Super Bowl and then he lost a Super Bowl, which that Super Bowl loss in a weird way kind of adds to his legacy because that play where all Pete Carroll had to do is give Lynch the ball on the 1 yard line, and instead he chooses to let Russell Wilson throw the ball. All of these things, as well as the fact that he's always had kind of a controversial personality and yet a pretty likeable one, it adds to the nostalgia around the Marshawn Lynch Seahawks career. And his Seahawks career was great, of course. And his Bills career did have a sour ending due to some off-the-field incidents. And then the coaches were leaving him off the field to try and discipline him. And then when he was on the field, he didn't have that same aggression to him. He had clearly lost the edge in that 3rd year for Buffalo. But those first 2 years, Marshawn Lynch was an animal. The way Lynch moved, considering the power he possessed, he was 215 pounds, but at 5'11" and just the way he was built, it looked like 240 pounds. I did snoop around after making this list and just had a quick glimpse out of intrigue at whether people were on the same page with some of these players. And not that anyone should be getting too upset over Reddit posts, but there was a post asking about people's top 5 running backs of the 21st century, and I could not believe that the majority of people did not include Marshawn Lynch. I saw lots of Edgerrin James, I saw LaShawn McCoy coming up a lot, Derrick Henry, Frank Gore, which of course I get. But not only was Marshawn Lynch my number 3 on this list, but he was not in much competition with the rest of the pack. So just to try and organise my thoughts here, the first 2 seasons in Buffalo, they were not blocking for him. According to PFF, they were about as bad as it gets in run blocking. So these 2 seasons he had to start his career. If he had the fortune of many other guys on this list and started behind a good offensive line, these 2 seasons would have been seen as 2 of the greatest seasons we've seen from a running back in this century. In his 4th season, he was traded and obviously had 4 incredible seasons with the Seahawks before having surgery in 2015 and actually retiring before returning in 2017. He returned with the Raiders, where he honestly still looked incredibly dynamic, but that was his final season in terms of any significant production. So in my opinion, we have 8 seasons of vision, contact balance, power, agility that is unparalleled in this century barring the next 2 guys. Marshawn Lynch deserves his number 3 spot. So it all comes down to this. The 2 that truly separate themselves from the rest are Adrian Peterson and LaDainian Tomlinson. Peterson had more of an extended career with remarkable substance, of course, finishing his career with 8 seasons over 1,000 rushing yards, the most impressive of which coming in 2012 when he won the MVP, recording over 2,000 rushing yards. LaDainian Tomlinson had more of a condensed career, but still also packed 8 seasons over 1,000 rushing yards, the best of which coming in 2006 where he also won the MVP, accumulating 1,815 rushing yards. The truth is, both these guys have everything. A combination of power, size, speed, agility, balance, vision, everything. I don't think one surpasses the other with the high-end traits, and so I separated them basically with a couple of nitpicks that could get in the way of success if this running back was on your team. In 3 of his 4 best seasons statistically, Peterson had 7 or more fumbles. He also, as much as on many occasions would turn this into something special, he could at times be overly ambitious and try to make something happen on every play. Tomlinson was creative of course, but also absolutely consistently providing nothing but good for his team. And so with an element of doubt, but also I believe in good reason, I am going to name LaDainian Tomlinson the greatest running back of the 21st century. So this is the list overall. In terms of guys I left out, Clinton Portis was the closest to making the list. Marshall Faulk was close as well, but he didn't have enough of his career in this century for me to involve him. Corey Dillon was close. Ezekiel Elliott actually has much more of an argument than you may immediately think. And then Tiki Barber, Priest Holmes, Ricky Williams, Curtis Martin and Alvin Kamara were the other guys who I took a look at but didn't make the cut. I hope you enjoyed the video. Unfortunately, I couldn't really show any clips and highlights and stuff because I don't want to be copyrighted, but I do encourage you to go and watch some of these guys. I think in particular, it's worth taking a look at Marshawn Lynch, Jamal Charles and Fred Taylor. I suppose, in my opinion, the most underappreciated running backs of this century. If you do enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. It would be very much appreciated, and I'll see you next time.